All right, we're going to continue our look at the prophet Hosea, this time in chapter 8. We're going to read all of it. It goes like this. Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of Yahweh, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel. A craftsman made it. It is not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces. For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads. It shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but Yahweh does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds. Well, you know the deal. When looking at a new chapter of Hosea, the question you'll find the answer to is this. What problems are going on in Israel this time around? Well, you could divide it up and say verses 1 through 3 say that they have sinned against God's law. Verses 4 through 6 condemn their choice of poor leadership. Verses 7 through 10 expose their foolish alliances. And verses 11 through 14 once again rebuke their false religious practices. But at the root of all these issues is a severe sense of self-reliance. Israel said, forget what God says, we'll do what we want to do. Forget the God-given government, we'll appoint our own kings. Forget that God is our help, we'll rely on Assyria and Egypt. Forget how and who God tells us to worship, we'll invent our own gods and our own rituals. Well, here's how God responds. Verse 1 through 3, it says, set the trumpet to your lips, one like a vulture is over the house of Yahweh, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. But Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. Here God counts in the band, getting them ready to start the song of warning for Israel. Get ready to blow the trumpet, he says. There's a vulture, an eagle, or a bird of prey circling above. The incoming judgment for their continued sin is hanging over them like a dark cloud, and the bottom is about ready to fall out. Everything's going to hit the fan any moment now. God was sending Assyria to swoop down like a bird and pluck Israel up out of his land. And this is basically their last chance to repent. But don't feel too bad for Israel. This punishment is not out of the blue. In fact, when God first made promises to these people before bringing them into the promised land, he told them this would happen if they broke their end of the covenant. And it specifically uses this language in Deuteronomy 28, starting in 45. It It says, all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you till you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh Elohim to keep his commandments and his statutes that he commanded you. They shall be a sign and a wonder against you and your offspring forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking everything. And he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like an eagle. There's that language. A nation whose language you do not understand. A hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. It shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. It also shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your herds, or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. That was God's warning all the way back in the time of Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. And that is exactly what's happening here in Hosea. Israel had transgressed God's covenant. They had crossed the lines. That's what that word means, transgressed. That's how we would say it. They've rebelled against God's law. And while they were treating everything God had done for them and everything God was to them with complete disregard, they cried out to him as if they were his friend. God, it's us, Israel. We know you. Help an old buddy out, would you? They sound like an old college roommate showing up unannounced at your doorstep 2 decades after graduation, asking for a place to stay. Or they sound like a long-lost family member who finally reaches out to you when they heard you made it famous, won the lottery, or got your inheritance from a dead family member. Well, at this stage in the game, Israel claimed to know God, but they didn't. They sound like the people who Paul warned Titus about in Titus chapter 1, verse 16, which says, they profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for any good work. So there were people in Crete who were claiming, oh, we do good works. Matter of fact, there is a good work that if you want the fullness of God, if you want God to really be pleased with you, you have to be circumcised. And we do that. We'll do that for you. We've done it to ourselves. And, matter of fact, we might not associate with you unless you go ahead and get this done. It's God's will. I mean, look at Abraham. He was circumcised. Don't you want to be Abraham's children? Don't you want to be like Abraham? So get circumcised, and then God will accept you. And so they claim to know God, to know the way of God, but Paul says, by their distortion of the gospel, by adding that to it, like, okay, yeah, Jesus is great and all, but circumcision, man. Like, yeah, Jesus was cut for you, but have you been cut for Jesus? That was their message. And Paul says, you know what? By their works, they actually deny God. They don't know God, even though they profess to. That was the case in Israel as well here in Hosea. They also sound like those who approach Jesus on Judgment Day. Remember in Matthew 7, he says, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we cast out demons in your name and prophesy in your name and do mighty works in your name? And he will say to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of iniquity. They came to Jesus talking about things they had done. And he says, I don't know you. It's also similar to the 5 foolish bridesmaids in one of Jesus's parables, who they didn't trim their lamps with oil, they didn't keep it topped up, and when it came time for the lamps to be lit and the groom was on his way, they had to run out and go buy some oil, and then when they came back, it was too late to get back into the party, and they knocked on the door, and the answer given to them was, I do not know who you are. So all these people saying they know God, we know you, help us out, but they didn't. That's the state of Israel at this time. They claim to know and love God, but Hosea accuses Israel of spurning, the Hebrew zanah, the good. It's a word that means stink. So I think the picture here is that Israel had turned up their noses at anything having to do with God. They say on one hand, we know you, God, help us out. But in reality, anything that the true God represents, would have them to do, they turn their nose up at it. They made kings, verse 4, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. Oh, see, now God is turning his nose up at Israel. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? That is the human condition. We're fallen into sin. We are incapable of being innocent. There's a theological term, I guess. Adam and Eve were created able to sin and able not to sin. But once the curses came from giving into that first sin, and they had offspring, and it just plunged the entire human race into sin, we all now inherit this nature of Adam. And we are incapable of being innocent. But that's a side note. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel. A craftsman made it. It is not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces. Well, even though God appointed Solomon to build a temple, which included a throne for Israel's kings, just see 1 Kings 7:7, and that was in Jerusalem, which is a southern city, Israel, the north, had put their own kings into power, none of whom had faith in Yahweh. You might remember that when Solomon died and his son Rehoboam took over, the people said to him, look, your dad was hard on us, requiring taxes and working hours for all his building projects. So please lighten up. But Rehoboam decided to amp it up and be even more harsh. He seeks counsel in some of his wise older men. They tell him, lighten up and these people will love you. Then he goes to his friends and they're like, this is your turn to get what you want. Ratchet up the tension. Get more out of these people. Squeeze them harder. And that's what he does. So when that happened, the northerners were fed up. They split off. They made Jeroboam their king as opposed to Rehoboam. And they went off into worshiping idols. In my opinion, both the leaders in the north and the south were at fault. But still, it's all these years later in the time of Hosea, and none of the northern kings have trusted in God. Now, Isaiah, writing about the same situation, says this in Isaiah 30, verses 1 and 2. Ah, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan but not mine, and who make an alliance but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. The people had kings, but not godly ones. They were following a plan, just not God's. They looked for help, just not from the Lord. They were dedicated worshipers, just not of Yahweh. And this is not a new development. It's not like Israel had been keeping God's law for generations. And then all of a sudden, in the days of Hosea, things went off the rails. In fact, this whole bit about an idol being from Israel, like if you turn over the golden calf and you look on the little the little hoof and see, it'll say made in Israel. All that business, the idols being made among God's people and how it's handmade by a craftsman, all that occurred as soon as God had given his covenant, which included the 10 Commandments, one of which was to not have any gods before me or to make a graven image. And here's one story you might remember that I think is applicable here. And it's Exodus 32. We're going to read verses 1 through 4 and then jump down a bit. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, they gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, down to verse 21, Moses says to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? And Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So I said to them, let any of you have gold, take it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. What a terrible excuse. But I just wanted to include that detail of the story and show you that Israel might be out of Egypt, but Egypt is not entirely out of Israel. They were idol worshipers at heart. And even though God had just written the command of not to worship other gods and not to make graven images to bow down to, that is exactly what they do. Now in verse 7, Hosea says, for they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. Now, maybe Israel would defend themselves against God's accusations by saying, oh, come on, all those times we bowed to statues or worshiped Baal, they didn't mean anything. And in a sense, God says, yeah, your words are worthless. They're like the wind, a vapor, thin air. That's what you've put into the equation, but what you're going to get out is a whirlwind, a tornado. It was going to blow through and destroy all the crops, and anything that was left would be eaten by others. Israel themselves would be eaten alive by their enemies, and all that would be left is a useless vessel. An empty, broken piece of Tupperware, we might picture it, or a restaurant to-go box with all the good food taken out of it. Now, amazingly enough, the Apostle Paul tells us that God has patience with useless vessels, which is insane because none of us really like to keep around cheap Tupperware. And none of us would keep an empty to-go box, I wouldn't think. Maybe for a while when you've emptied out a tub of country crock butter, you use that for some leftovers. I don't know. That's how sometimes we do it in the South, but that is usually not how things go for a long time. But God, according to Paul, is patient with useless vessels. Check this out in Romans 9, starting in 22. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath made fit for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people, and her who was not my beloved, I will call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. So you have it right there in Paul's quotation of Hosea. Some of those who were not God's people will be called God's people. And God can take sinners who've made themselves fit for wrath. Take notice there, it does not say God created these creatures for wrath. That is not what it says. Some people have tried to make it say that. That is not what it says, especially when you dig into the Greek. But God can take sinners who've made themselves fit for wrath, which is every person. Remember, we talked about the incapability of us to be innocent. And he can make them into vessels or dishes or objects who will receive mercy. And just for a fabulous cross-reference here, let's go to Ephesians 2, starting in verse 1. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath. Think vessels of wrath, like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. So there's my way of taking this condemnation of Israel. They have become a useless vessel. Does that mean that every single person in Israel is doomed eternally? No. No, because God is patient, even with useless, empty, broken dishes. And he can make them fit by giving them mercy. Verse 9 and 10, for they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. So what's going on there is that Israel is going to hire an ally who is then going to betray them, and then they're going to be kicking themselves because they helped someone who stabbed them in the back. But I do want to point out, if you read verse 9 in the King James, it is a much better insult than a wild donkey. Our modern translations use that term, and that is still a burn. It is not the nice, cute little donkey you see on a farm, but this blonde-haired donkey that is a little different, and it only appears a few times in Scripture. The time that is of note is in Genesis, Ishmael, Abraham's illegitimate son, is called a wild donkey, same Hebrew word, in Genesis 16, 11, and 12. And the significance of this connection is that while Ishmael was a son of Abraham, he was not the son of the promise. He was not the son that God miraculously provided to Abram and Sarai in their old age. In the same way, this generation of Israel and the unbelievers in it especially, who are carrying out all this sin and unrepentance and rebellion against God with no faith and worshiping others, they are technically part of God's people, Israel, but they are not children of the promise. They are not living out the fact that they are Israel with faith in God and the things he's promised to give. And 11 and 12 of Hosea 9, it says, because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. So currently, Israel was in the process of creating new ways of worshiping new gods. They were so far removed from the Torah, the Old Testament, that it was strange to them. Someone could walk up to them at the market, quote a Bible verse, and they'd say, I've got no clue what you're talking about, dude. You've probably seen people do that on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. People say, hey, I'll give you $20 or I'll pay for your gas or your groceries if you can name one Bible verse. And people are like, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And I'm so frustrated because, like, that seems so easy to me, but I've just grown up immersed in that. And, you know, we're serious about that stuff. But to these people, that's a strange thing. It's a nuisance. They're like, I don't want to talk about it. Get out of my face. And the guy's like, I'm offering to pay for your gas, your groceries, save you hundreds of dollars. But it's strange to them. Now, things were eerily similar in Greece during the time of Paul, where the things of God were strange to the people. Even though they were extremely religious in Greece, just think about Greek mythology, still something that people know and study today. Greece was very religious, just not about Christ. And Paul had a little run-in there, and he stood up and spoke. It's in Acts 17. Paul in Athens, the capital city of Greece. In verse 16 of Acts 17, it says, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. Yeah, so Paul's words, the gospel of Jesus Christ, had become strange, or it was strange in Athens, just like in the time of Hosea. God's law, even among Israel, was a strange thing. Our world today is no different. Don't believe the polls. People are more religious than they've ever been. We just have different gods and different places of worship. You could think of, malls or the internet as a place of worship, or restaurants, or we worship money, we worship our career, we worship social media, we worship whatever it is. We're very religious about many things in culture, just usually not about the one true God. And that's kind of where this ends up in Hosea in verses 13 and 14, where the key phrase is, Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities, so I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds. Israel has forgotten his maker. That could sum up this entire chapter, that one little detail. Israel's maker. That's who Yahweh is. And the lesson there is that we should worship the one who made us, not the things that we make. If you have a God and you can turn over the shoe on the God like a toy, like Woody in Toy Story, and there's a name on the bottom of the shoe, and it says made in the USA on your God, or made in Noah's heart, or so-and-so's heart, or made by anyone, that is not something you should be worshiping. We worship the maker, not anything that has been made, especially not anything we have made. And That is Hosea chapter 8.